Hello there and welcome to part 6, the final part of the 6-part audio podcast series, Beethoven's Secret Life. Now, everybody knows the name Beethoven in classical circles. Everybody knows his 4 famous notes of the opening 5th Symphony. Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. But not a lot of people know other things about the great man. He truly was a most complex human being. You have to remember, this was the young lad whose father was a terrible tyrant and who would force the young boy Beethoven to practice for long hours, well into the night, and he would beat him severely if he made mistakes. He would be flung in a cellar. But the dad, was not a particularly good role model because he was an alcoholic, and no doubt that played a part in the severity of how he treated the young lad. The dad knew that Mozart was a child prodigy and obviously was quite devious and tried to make capital from the young Beethoven. And he was advertised. Beethoven himself said that basically he started off when he was 4, but according to sources, basically we reckon that he was more 6 or 7, although an advertisement when he was 6 from 1778 had basically advertised the fact that Beethoven's father, who's a tenor singer, and it says, quote, the advert, will have the honour to produce 2 of his scholars, and basically his little son of 6 years as one of the scholars, obviously. And we know that Beethoven was not a child prodigy like Mozart. Beethoven had considerable tuition on pianoforte or harpsichord, whatever, from his dad. And then he went on, he met Neef, and he was taught in the organ, basically. There was 2 people taught him organ, but Neef was the one that kind of expanded his mind, if you like. And Neef also was a great door opener for the young Beethoven, and he introduced him into higher circles, and this helped build Beethoven's reputation. The Beethoven also, when he was learning instruments, he had a go at the violin and viola, but that wasn't his instrument. His instrument was to be the piano, at which he would excel fantastically. And even Beethoven himself said that when he played viola and violin, it was enough to frighten away spiders and flies. So that gives you an indication of what he thought of his own expertise on the violin and viola. Even at school, actually, and I can relate to this, and I'm an amateur composer, Beethoven struggled with sums. Now, I've always had no problem with words, but I definitely struggled with arithmetic and mathematics, and I'm still no great shakes, and it gives me no end of trouble when it comes to composing. And Beethoven basically said, music comes to me easier and more readily than words, Now, people wonder, did Beethoven ever meet Mozart? Well, the thing is, when Beethoven went to Vienna, he was hoping to study with Mozart, but again, fate stepped in, as it always does, because his poor mother died. She had fallen ill and he had to return home to Bonn, basically. So straight away, he never got the chance to study under Mozart. However, later on in life, he got the chance to be one of Joseph Haydn's pupils, and he stayed with Joseph Haydn for a while, learning from him. And Haydn, who was dubbed the father of the string quartet and the father of the symphony, basically, by that time, I think there was not a lot that Beethoven needed to learn by that time. And Haydn was well up in years, and he taught him a little bit of composition. And in his early years, of course, Beethoven was taught vocal composition by no less than the great Salieri, whom we hear about in relation to Mozart. So Beethoven had lots and lots and lots and lots of different teachers teaching him different aspects of music theory and compositional theory, basically. But it was Beethoven's own innate, unique talent and the way his mind thought that made him different from Mozart, Beethoven, Bach and anybody else, because I think Beethoven was able to think outside the box, basically. And I stated earlier that you can never quite plan where he's going when you listen to his music, because it seems to go here, there and everywhere, and yet there's a thread runs through everything. Mozart's music is very mathematical. It's like a chess game. It has a beginning, a middle game, and an end. And that's it, and you can follow it fairly easily. But Beethoven's is very, very different. And it's almost like, maybe a drink that you've tried for the first time and you think, I'm not so sure of that. It's an acquired taste. And later on you become to enjoy it more and more. And this is the thing with Beethoven. He's not the easiest listen to get into when you listen to his later works. But he's very, very rewarding, if you like. Now, we've covered very briefly Beethoven and Haydn, Beethoven as a prodigy, but there's still one last secret to reveal. Beethoven was a very difficult character. He seemed to be at odds with everybody. You could say he was a square peg in a round hole. He just didn't fit in that well. He didn't gel. And he had countless fallouts, arguments, disagreements with everybody he met. From landlords to dukes and earls, counts, even his friend, Wegeler, he fell out with him countless times and had to eat humble pie in letters and things like that. But he was hiding a secret. People thought he was rude, arrogant, standoffish, and antisocial, and not very hospitable. They thought he was gruff and had no manners. And that's because of his mindset, because he never bowed or scraped to authority. And as I stated earlier, he was even given the run of a noble's place, whereas other people would be told about their etiquette, how to bow and scrape and where to go and where not to go. Beethoven never had that. He crashed through the crash barriers of polite society, and his talent shone through, and people thought, well, that's just Beethoven. He gets away with it. You could say that musically he was amoral because rules were not meant for him like they were for ordinary mortals, if I can say that. But let's talk about the very last secret of Beethoven. Beethoven suffered from a lot of illnesses. He ate the wrong things, food that wasn't particularly good for him. He had too much wine, that possibly came from the father, because these things can run generationally. But he also, as I said, he drank loads and loads of coffee. And I think all these things contributed, the poor diet, the wine drinking, the excess coffee drinking, as well as probably a mental condition, which was bipolar disease, basically, whereby he would, shoot from mania down to depression. He even talks about that himself. But the thing is, Beethoven couldn't cope with a lot of things that went on in the world. And again, I can associate this with him. I was always a little boy who was in his head, in his mind. My older brothers used to call me fairy head because I was always playing by myself in my own little world. And I think Beethoven was very much like that. And in his mind, he would be transported to music land, right? Wherever that might have been. And that was to escape the harshness of the upbringing and the beatings and everything that he'd to endure. And it never left him. And that's why he was able to produce some of the finest music ever written by any composer, by any standards. So let's have a look at this last final secret. This is a secret that Beethoven kept with him for the whole of his life, and it was only after he died, when things were published and letters and notes were rifled through and read assiduously, that this thing was discovered. It's known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. It was dated October the 6th in 1802. And in his own words, Beethoven is basically answering the criticisms of the people who knew him and couldn't understand him and thought him to be antisocial and aloof and rough and gruff and all these things. And he wanted to set the record straight with them. And he writes, "O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly you do wrong me." And here we come to his secret. He says, "You do not know the secret cause." There it is. "You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you." And then he even reveals an even deeper emotional secret. He talks about how he had plumbed the depths of despair and was at suicide's door. He says, "You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you, and I would have ended my life." What was his saviour? What was his redeeming thing? He says, "It was only my art," in other words, his music, "that held me back." And here's an amazing, heartfelt piece of sentiment from the great man. He says, "It seemed impossible for him to leave the world," he says, "until I had brought forth all that was within me." It was almost as if Beethoven knew that he had to have this inner knowing that he had written everything that he should have written and could have written in his lifetime, and then he could exit the world stage. So there was a knowing there, a deep knowing with Beethoven. And, he did leave a few secrets with us as well about, the women in his life. So I want to leave you with a final thing.